Book Talk begins at 3 minutes and 33 seconds.
Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 613, Gaslight. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by its listeners. Well, hello. How are you? I am actually not feeling too hot today, but tomorrow is election day or primary day here in Pennsylvania. So I will be working the polls again. And so I am trying to convalesce right now so that I am up to it for tomorrow. But mostly I think I just want to lie in bed and eat potatoes. That's just not good. So, you take what comes, yada, yada, yada. But good news is for patrons over on Patreon who have pledged at the movie party level, I have picked the movie. And after this one, y'all will pick. But for now, I'm picking the first one, and it is Gaslight, because it's a term, it's kind of a craft-litty thing, right? It's a term that everybody uses, but the only people I know who've watched the movie are me and the kids. So that's what we're going to do. And along with Patreon and all of the social media stuff, I wanted to send out a big thank you to all of you who have continued to listen, even when things were sporadic. And I'll be honest with you, I was having a very, very hard time being on social media for the last few years. I still have a hard time being on social media. I don't think that it's for the reasons that people might assume. I've been noticing this too with other content creators, either on YouTube or podcasters, people who've been doing this for a while. There comes a point where it's not burnout so much as it is just wrestling with the nihilistic futility of the existential morass in which we find ourselves, I think. I just came up with that on the fly. I'm really proud of myself. It is accurate, though. There's a lot to be very frustrated with in the world right now, and content creators who are doing their best to put out positive things, it's hard. It's just hard. So I wanted to thank you so much for being patient with me in long gaps in me not responding to questions or messages or email. I really wanted to say thank you. And another way of saying thank you is saying today, you are going to get to hear two of the most famous chapters in The Three Musketeers. If movie versions get anything right, it is these two chapters. And I also think you will see actual proof in these chapters that when Dumas is just doing dialogue, nobody can outdo Dumas. Just like with Dickens and little homeless, starving waifs, nobody does them like Dickens. Dumas, nobody does. His humor sounds so very modern. Even the Victorian translation does. So I can't wait for you to listen. Okay, so first thing, do not forget that part of D'Artagnan's father's instructions were fight everybody, but not the cardinal or, the cardinal's people, the king's people, or Treville. These are the people who are out of bounds. So that's number one. Number two, cambric. Cambric comes up a lot from time to time. And just as a reminder, it's a very lightweight but densely woven, closely woven cotton or linen fabric, and it's usually white. So all of those things put together means that costs money because it's not coarsely woven, it's white, and it's very, very, very fine fibers that they are weaving with. So there's that. There is a passing reference, but it is a joke. There is a passing reference to the judgment of Solomon. And just in case it slipped your mind, there was a passage in the Bible. I can actually get you the chapter and verse for it. But there's a passage in the Bible where two women come to King Solomon and say, hey, this baby is my baby. I want my baby. And Solomon, in his wisdom, says, okay, we're going to put the baby here in a circle, and then we're going to cut the baby in half, and you can each get half. And the non-actual mother says, awesome. And the real mother says, take him. Because a real mother would do anything to keep their child alive and well, even if that means giving them up. So that story is used as part of a joke in our first chapter today, chapter 4. There is a word that I have never come across before, and I actually thought, oh, this must be some weird Victorian thing that I'm going to have a hard time finding a definition for. And the answer was, no, Heather, you just hadn't heard it before. Casuist. 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 It's a person who's very, very clever, but their reasoning is unsound. So they come up with some pretty weird reasons for why things, but it sounds logical. I think it's a word that I'm going to be using more frequently now. I like that. There's also something that's referred to as the Samaritan, which I had never heard about before either. So I'm just going to read you the footnote, and I'll let you know, I had a hard time finding an image. Doesn't exist anymore. I had a hard time finding an image even from back in the day, because there is now there's a department store called the Samaritan. And yeah, so that's taken over. But the original, the one that we're talking about, is the first machine for drawing water constructed in Paris. Henry IV ordered it from a Flemish hydraulic engineer, because you know those Flemish hydraulics. Yeah. They had it installed on the newly completed Pont Neuf in 1605. This pump was powered by a water wheel, and it raised water to a basin at street level. Above that was a building topped by a belfry with a 24-bell carillon and an astronomical clock. Doesn't this sound cool? The facade was decorated with a bas-relief portraying Christ's meeting with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. The reference to it is odd. It's all about being on time. And I'm not sure if that reference is to the fact that the water was always there when you expected it, or that because it was powered by a water wheel, sometimes the clock was accurate and sometimes not so much. I'm not entirely sure which way they're going with it, but now you know what it is. All right, the last thing that I have before we start the chapters is when you start hearing the name Jussac, Jussac, he's a real guy. All of the people with him are real guys. They were all there during this time period. And people at various levels in society. Obviously, they were wealthy enough or important enough to have been written about in historical documents, and that's why we know that they're real. So there's that. All right. As before with last week, I'm going to give you the time code now so that if you want to listen to the Three Musketeers chapters on a better recording, you can just come back and pick up on the flip side at
53 minutes and 15 seconds.
All right, Here we go with Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers, chapters 4 and 5.
The shoulder of Athos, the baldric of Porthos, and the handkerchief of Aramis. D'Artagnan, in a state of fury, crossed the antechamber at 3 bounds, and was darting down the stairs while he reckoned upon descending 4 at a time, when, in his heedless course, he ran head foremost against a musketeer who was coming out of one of Monsieur de Tréville's private rooms, and striking his shoulder violently, made him utter a cry, or rather a howl. "Excuse me," said D'Artagnan, endeavoring to resume his course. "Excuse me, but I am in a hurry." Scarcely had he descended the first stair when a hand of iron seized him by the belt and stopped him. "You are in a hurry?" said the musketeer, as pale as a sheet. "Under that pretense you run against me? You say, 'Excuse me,' and you believe that is sufficient? Not at all, my young man. Do you fancy because you have heard Monsieur de Tréville speak to us a little cavalierly today, that other people are to treat us as he speaks to us? Undeceive yourself, comrade. You are not Monsieur de Tréville." "My faith," replied D'Artagnan, recognizing Athos, who, after the dressing performed by the doctor, was returning to his old apartment. "I did not do it intentionally, and not doing it intentionally, I said, 'Excuse me.' It appears to me that this is quite enough. I repeat to you, however, and this time on my word of honor, I think perhaps too often, that I am in haste, great haste. Leave your hold, then, I beg of you, and let me go where my business calls me." "Monsieur," said Athos, letting him go, "you are not polite. It is easy to perceive that you come from a distance." D'Artagnan had already strode down 3 or 4 stairs, but at Athos's last remark he stopped short. "Morbleu, monsieur," said he, "however far I come, it is not you who can give me a lesson in good manners. I warn you." "Perhaps," said Athos. "If I were not in such haste, and if I were not running after someone," said D'Artagnan. "Monsieur, man in a hurry, you can find me without running. Me, you understand." "And where, I pray you?" "Near the Carmes Deschaux." "At what hour?" "About noon." "About noon? That will do. I will be there." "Endeavor not to make me wait, for at 12:15 I will cut off your ears as you run." "Good!" cried D'Artagnan. "I will be there 10 minutes before 12." And he set off running as if the devil possessed him, hoping that he might yet find the stranger whose slow pace could not have carried him far. But at the street gate, Porthos was talking with the soldier on guard. Between the two talkers there was just enough room for a man to pass. D'Artagnan thought it would suffice for him, and he sprang forward like a dart between them. But D'Artagnan had reckoned without the wind. As he was about to pass, the wind blew out Porthos's long cloak, and D'Artagnan rushed straight into the middle of it. Without doubt, Porthos had reasons for not abandoning this part of his vestments, for instead of quitting his hold on the flap in his hand, he pulled it toward him, so that D'Artagnan rolled himself up in the velvet by a movement of rotation explained by the persistency of Porthos. D'Artagnan, hearing the Musketeer swear, wished to escape from the cloak, which blinded him, and sought to find his way from under the folds of it. He was particularly anxious to avoid marring the freshness of the magnificent baldric we are acquainted with, but on timidly opening his eyes, he found himself with his nose fixed between the 2 shoulders of Porthos, that is to say, exactly upon the baldric. Alas, like most things in this world which have nothing in their favor but appearances, the baldric was glittering with gold in the front, but was nothing but simple buff behind. Vainglorious as he was, Porthos could not afford to have a baldric wholly of gold, but had at least half. One could comprehend the necessity of the cold and the urgency of the cloak. "Bless me!" cried Porthos, making strong efforts to disembarrass himself of D'Artagnan, who was wriggling about his back. "You must be mad to run against people in this manner." "Excuse me," said D'Artagnan, reappearing under the shoulder of the giant. But I am in such haste. I was running after someone, and—"
"And do you always forget your eyes when you run?"
asked Porthos. "No," replied D'Artagnan, piqued. "And thanks to my eyes, I can see what other people cannot see." Whether Porthos understood him or did not understand him, giving way to his anger,
"Monsieur,"
said he,
"you stand a chance of getting chastised if you rub Musketeers in this fashion."
"Chastised, monsieur?" said D'Artagnan. "The expression is strong."
"It is one that becomes a man accustomed to look his enemies in the face."
"Ah, pardieu! I know full well that you don't turn your back to yours." And the young man, delighted with his joke, went away laughing loudly. Porthos foamed with rage, and made a movement to rush after D'Artagnan. "Presently, presently," cried the latter, "when you haven't your cloak on."
"At 1 o'clock, then, behind the Luxembourg."
"Very well, at 1 o'clock, then," replied D'Artagnan, turning the angle of the street. But neither in the street he had passed through, nor in the one which his eager glance pervaded, could he see anyone, however slowly the stranger had walked. He was gone on his way, or perhaps had entered some house. D'Artagnan inquired of everyone he met with, went down to the ferry, came up again by the Rue de Seine and the Red Cross, but nothing, absolutely nothing. This chase was, however, advantageous to him in one sense, for in proportion as the perspiration broke from his forehead, his heart began to cool. He began to reflect upon the events that had passed. They were numerous and inauspicious. It was scarcely 11 o'clock in the morning, and yet this morning had already brought him into disgrace with M. de Tréville, who could not fail to think the manner in which D'Artagnan had left him a little cavalier. Besides this, he had drawn upon himself 2 good duels with 2 men, each capable of killing 3 D'Artagnans, with 2 Musketeers, in short, with 2 of those beings whom he esteemed so greatly that he placed them in his mind and heart above all other men. The outlook was sad. Sure of being killed by Athos, it may easily be understood that the young man was not very uneasy about Porthos. As hope, however, is the last thing extinguished in the heart of man, he finished by hoping that he might survive, even though with terrible wounds, in both these duels. And in case of surviving, he made the following reprehensions upon his own conduct. "What a madcap I was, and what a stupid fellow I am! That brave and unfortunate Athos was wounded on that very shoulder against which I must run head foremost like a ram. The only thing that astonishes me is that he did not strike me dead at once. He had good cause to do so. The pain I gave him must have been atrocious. As to Porthos, faith, that's a droll affair." And in spite of himself, the young man began to laugh aloud, looking round carefully, however, to see that his solitary laugh, without a cause in the eyes of passers-by, offended by no one. "As to Porthos, that is certainly droll, but I am not the less a giddy fool. Are people to be run against without warning? No. And I have any right to go and peep under their cloaks to see what is not there? He would have pardoned me. He would certainly have pardoned me if I had not said anything to him about that cursed baldric. In ambiguous words, it is true, but rather drolly ambiguous. Cursed Gascon that I am, I get from one hobble into another. Friend D'Artagnan," continued he, speaking to himself with all the amenity that he thought due himself, "if you escape, of which there is not much chance, I would advise you to practice perfect politeness for the future. You must henceforth be admired and quoted as a model of it. To be obliging and polite does not necessarily make a man a coward. Look at Aramis, now. Aramis is mildness and grace personified. Well, did anybody ever dream of calling Aramis a coward? No, certainly not. And from this moment I will endeavor to model myself after him. Ha! That's strange. Here he is." D'Artagnan, walking and soliloquizing, had arrived within a few steps of the Hôtel d'Aiguillon, and in front of that hotel perceived Aramis, chatting gaily with 3 gentlemen, But as he had not forgotten that it was in presence of this young man that Monsieur de Tréville had been so angry in the morning, and as a witness of the rebuke the Musketeers had received was not likely to be at all agreeable, he pretended not to see him. D'Artagnan, on the contrary, quite full of his plans of conciliation and courtesy, approached the young men with a profound bow, accompanied by a most gracious smile. All four, besides, immediately broke off their conversation. D'Artagnan was not so dull as not to perceive that he was one too many, but he was not sufficiently broken into the fashions of the gay world to know how to extricate himself gallantly from a false position, like that of a man who begins to mingle with people he is scarcely acquainted with, and in a conversation that does not concern him. He was seeking in his mind, then, for the least awkward means of retreat, when he remarked that Aramis had let his handkerchief fall, and by mistake, no doubt, had placed his foot upon it. This appeared to be a favorable opportunity to repair his intrusion. He stooped, and with the most gracious air he could assume, drew the handkerchief from under the foot of the Musketeer in spite of the efforts the latter made to detain it, and holding it out to him, said, "I believe, monsieur, that this is a handkerchief you would be sorry to lose." The handkerchief was indeed richly embroidered, and had a coronet and arms at one of its corners. Aramis blushed excessively, and snatched rather than took the handkerchief from the hand of the Gascon. "Ha, ha, ha!" cried one of the guards. "Will you persist in saying, most discreet Aramis, that you are not on good terms with Madame de Bois Tracy, when that gracious lady has the kindness to lend you one of her handkerchiefs?" Aramis darted at D'Artagnan one of those looks which inform a man that he has acquired a mortal enemy. Then resuming his mild air, "You are deceived, gentlemen," said he. "This handkerchief is not mine, and I cannot fancy why monsieur has taken it into his head to offer it to me rather than to one of you. And as a proof of what I say, here is mine in my pocket." So saying, he pulled out his own handkerchief, likewise a very elegant handkerchief, in a fine cambric, though cambric was dear at that period, but a handkerchief without embroidery and without arms, only ornamented with a single cipher, that of its proprietor. This time D'Artagnan was not hasty. He perceived his mistake, but the friends of Aramis were not at all convinced by his denial, and one of them addressed the young Musketeer with affected seriousness. "If it were as you pretend it is," said he, "I should be forced, my dear Aramis, to reclaim it myself, for, as you very well know, Bois Tracy is an intimate friend of mine, and I cannot allow the property of his wife to be sported as a trophy." "You make the demand badly," replied Aramis, "and while acknowledging the justice of your reclamation, I refuse it on account of the form." "The fact is," hazarded D'Artagnan timidly, "I did not see the handkerchief fall from the pocket of Monsieur Aramis. He had his foot upon it, that is all, and I thought from having his foot upon it the handkerchief was his." "And you were deceived, my dear sir," replied Aramis coldly, very little sensible to the reparation. Then turning toward that one of the guards who had declared himself the friend of Bois Tracy, "Besides," continued he, "I have reflected, my dear intimate of Bois Tracy, that I am not less tenderly his friend than you can possibly be, so that decidedly this handkerchief is as likely to have fallen from your pocket as mine." "No, upon my honor," cried his Majesty's guardsman. "You are about to swear upon your honor, and I upon my word, and then it will be pretty evident that one of us will have lied. Now, here, Montaran, we will do better than that. Let each take a half." "Of the handkerchief?" "Yes." "Perfectly just," cried the other two guardsmen. "The judgment of King Solomon! Aramis, you certainly are full of wisdom." The young men burst into a laugh, and as may be supposed, the affair had no other sequel. In a moment or two the conversation ceased, and the three guardsmen and the Musketeer, after having cordially shaken hands, separated, the guardsman going one way and Aramis another. "Now is my time to make peace with this gallant man," said D'Artagnan to himself, having stood on one side during the whole of the latter part of the conversation, and with his good feeling drawing near to Aramis, who was departing without paying any attention to him. "Monsieur," said he, "you will excuse me, I hope."
"Ah, monsieur," interrupted Aramis, "permit me to observe to you that you have not acted in this affair as a gallant man ought."
"What, monsieur?" cried D'Artagnan. "And do you suppose—"
"I suppose, monsieur, that you are not a fool, and that you knew very well, although coming from Gascony, that people do not tread upon handkerchiefs without a reason. What the devil! Paris is not paved with cambric."
"Monsieur, you act wrongly in endeavoring to mortify me," said D'Artagnan, in whom the natural quarrelsome spirit began to speak more loudly than his pacific resolutions. "I am from Gascony, it's true, and since you know it, there is no occasion to tell you that Gascons are not very patient, and so that when they have begged to be excused once, were it even for a folly, they are convinced that they have done already at least as much again as they ought to have done."
"Monsieur, what I say to you about the matter," said Aramis, "is not for the sake of seeking a quarrel. Thank God, I am not a bravo. And being a musketeer, but only for a time, I only fight when I am forced to do so, and always with great repugnance. But this time, the affair is serious, for here, a lady compromised by you."
"By us, you mean?" cried D'Artagnan.
"Why did you so maladroitly restore me the handkerchief?"
"Why did you so awkwardly let it fall?"
"I have said, monsieur, and I repeat, that the handkerchief did not fall from my pocket."
"And thereby you have lied twice, monsieur, for I saw it fall."
"Ah, you take it with that tone, do you, Master Gascon? Well, I will teach you how to behave yourself."
"And I will send you back to your mass book, Master Abbé. Draw, if you please, and instantly."
"Not so. If you please, my good friend, not here, at least. Do you not perceive that we are opposite the Hôtel d'Auguron, which is full of the cardinal's creatures? How do I know that this is not his eminence, who has honored you with the commission to procure my head? Now, I entertain a ridiculous partiality for my head. It seems to suit my shoulders so correctly. I wish to kill you. Be at rest as to that, but to kill you quietly in a snug, remote place, where you will not be able to boast of your death to anybody."
"I agree, monsieur, but do not be too confident. Take your handkerchief, whether it belongs to you or another. You may perhaps stand in need of it."
"Monsieur is a Gascon?"
asked Aramis. "Yes. Monsieur does not postpone an interview through prudence."
"Prudence, monsieur, is a virtue sufficiently useless to musketeers. I know, but indispensable to churchmen, and as I am only a musketeer provisionally, I hold it good to be prudent. At 2 o'clock, I shall have the honor of expecting you at the hotel of Monsieur de Tréville. There, I will indicate to you the best place and time."
The two young men bowed and separated. Aramis ascended the street which led to the Luxembourg, while D'Artagnan, perceiving the appointed hour was approaching, took the road to the Carme Deschaux, saying to himself, "Decidedly, I can't draw back. But at least if I am killed, I shall be killed by a musketeer." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the D'Artagnan Romances, Volume 1. The King's Musketeers and the Cardinal's Guards. D'Artagnan was acquainted with nobody in Paris. He went therefore to his appointment with Athos without a second, determined to be satisfied with those his adversary should choose. Besides, his intention was formed to make the brave Musketeer all suitable apologies, but without meanness or weakness, fearing that might result from this duel which generally results from an affair of this kind, when a young and vigorous man fights with an adversary who is wounded and weakened. If conquered, he doubles the triumph of his antagonist. If a conqueror, he is accused of foul play and want of courage. Now, we must have badly painted the character of our adventure-seeker, or our readers must have already perceived that D'Artagnan was not an ordinary man. Therefore, While repeating to himself that his death was inevitable, he did not make up his mind to die quietly, as one less courageous and less restrained might have done in his place. He reflected upon the different characters of those with whom he was going to fight, and began to view his situation more clearly. He hoped by means of loyal excuses to make a friend of Athos, whose lordly air and austere bearing pleased him much. He flattered himself he should be able to frighten Porthos with the adventure of the baldric, which he might, if not killed upon the spot, relate to everybody a recital which, well managed, would cover Porthos with ridicule. As to the astute Aramis, he did not entertain much dread of him, and supposing he should be able to get so far, he determined to dispatch him in a good style, or at least by hitting him in the face, as Caesar recommended his soldiers do to those of Pompey, to damage forever the beauty of which he was so proud. In addition to this, D'Artagnan possessed that invincible stock of resolution which the counsels of his father had implanted in his heart.
Endure nothing from anyone but the king, the cardinal, and Monsieur de Tréville.
He flew rather than walked toward the convent of the Carmes Déchaussés, or rather Deschaux, as it was called at that period, a sort of building without a window, surrounded by barren fields, an accessory to the Preux Clercs, and which was generally employed as the place for the duels of men who had no time to lose. When D'Artagnan arrived in sight of the bare spot of ground which extended along the foot of the monastery, Athos had been waiting for 5 minutes, and 12 o'clock was striking. He was then as punctual as the Samaritan woman, and the most rigorous casuist with regard to duels could have nothing to say. Athos, who still suffered grievously from his wound, though it had been dressed anew by Monsieur de Tréville's surgeon, was seated on a post and waiting for his adversary with hat in hand, his feather even touching the ground.
"Monsieur," said Athos, "I have engaged 2 of my friends as seconds, but these 2 friends are not yet come, at which I am astonished, as it is not at all their custom."
"I have no seconds on my part, monsieur," said D'Artagnan. "For having only arrived yesterday in Paris, I as yet know no one but Monsieur de Tréville, to whom I was recommended by my father, who has the honor to be in some degree one of his friends."
Athos reflected for an instant.
"You know no one but Monsieur de Tréville?"
he asked.
"Yes, monsieur, I only know him."
"Well, but then," continued Athos, speaking half to himself, "if I kill you, I shall have the air of a boy-slayer."
"Not too much so,"
replied D'Artagnan with a bow that was not deficient in dignity, "since you do me the honor to draw a sword with me while suffering from a wound which is very inconvenient."
"Very inconvenient, upon my word. And you hurt me devilishly, I can tell you. But I will take the left hand. It is my custom in such circumstances. Do not fancy that I do you a favor. I use either hand easily, and it will be a disadvantage to you. A left-handed man is very troublesome to people who are not prepared for it. I regret I did not inform you sooner of this circumstance."
"You have truly, monsieur," said D'Artagnan, bowing again, "a courtesy for which I assure you I am very grateful."
"You confuse me," replied Athos with his gentlemanly air. "Let us talk of something else, if you please. Ah, s'blood, how you have hurt me! My shoulder quite burns."
"If you would permit me," said D'Artagnan with timidity.
"What, monsieur?"
"I have a miraculous balsam for wounds, a balsam given to me by my mother, and of which I have made a trial upon myself."
"Well?"
"Well, I am sure that in less than 3 days this balsam would cure you, and at the end of 3 days, when you would be cured, well, sir, it would still do me a great honor to be your man." D'Artagnan spoke these words with a simplicity that did honor to his courtesy, without throwing the least doubt upon his courage.
"Pardieu, monsieur," said Athos, "that's a proposition that pleases me. Not that I can accept it, but a league of it savors of the gentleman.
Thus spoke and acted the gallant knights of the time of Charlemagne, in whom every cavalier ought to seek his model. Unfortunately, we do not live in the times of the great emperor, we live in the times of the cardinal. And 3 days hence, however, well, the secret might be guarded, it would be known. I say, that we were to fight and our combat would be prevented. I think these fellows will never come.
If you are in haste, monsieur, said D'Artagnan with the same simplicity with which a moment before he had proposed to him to put off the duel for 3 days, and if it be your will to dispatch me at once, do not inconvenience yourself, I pray you.
There is another word which pleases me, cried Athos, with a gracious nod to D'Artagnan. That did not come from a man without a heart. Monsieur, I love men of your kidney, and I foresee plainly that if we don't kill each other, I should hereafter have much pleasure in your conversation. We will wait for these gentlemen, so please you. I have plenty of time, and it will be more correct. Ah, here is one of them, I believe.
In fact, at the end of the Rue Vaugirard, the gigantic Porthos appeared.
What?
cried D'Artagnan. Is your first witness Monsieur Porthos?
Yes, that disturbs you.
By no means.
And here is the second.
D'Artagnan turned in the direction pointed to by Athos and perceived Aramis.
What?
cried he in an accent of greater astonishment than before. Your second witness is Monsieur Aramis?
Doubtless. Are you not aware that we are never seen one without the others, and that we are called among the Musketeers and the Guards, at court and in the city, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, or the three inseparables? And yet, as you come from Dax or Pau, from Tarbes, said D'Artagnan, it is probable you are ignorant of this little fact, said Athos.
My faith, replied D'Artagnan, you are well-named gentlemen, and my adventure, if it should make any noise, will prove at least that your union is not founded upon contrasts. In the meantime, Porthos had come up, waved his hand to Athos, and then turning toward D'Artagnan, stood quite astonished. Let us say in passing that he changed his baldric and relinquished his cloak.
Ha ha ha, said he. What does this mean?
This is the gentleman I am going to fight with,
said Athos, pointing to D'Artagnan with his hand and saluting him with the same gesture.
Why, it is with him I am also going to fight, said Porthos.
But not before 1 o'clock, replied D'Artagnan.
But I also am to fight with this gentleman,
said Aramis, coming in his turn into the place. But not until 2 o'clock, said D'Artagnan with the same calmness.
But what are you going to fight about, Athos?
asked Aramis.
Faith, I don't very well know. He hurt my shoulder, and you, Porthos?
Faith, I am going to fight because I am going to fight,
answered Porthos, reddening. Athos, whose keen eye lost nothing, perceived a faintly sly smile pass over the lips of the young Gascon as he replied, "We had a short discussion upon dress."
"And you, Aramis?"
asked Athos.
"Oh, ours is a theological quarrel,"
replied Aramis, making a sign to D'Artagnan to keep secret the cause of their duel. Athos indeed saw a second smile on the lips of D'Artagnan.
"Indeed?"
said Athos. "Yes, a passage of St. Augustine upon which we could not agree," said the Gascon.
"Decidedly, this is a clever fellow,"
murmured Athos. "And now you are assembled, gentlemen," said D'Artagnan. "Permit me to offer you my apologies." At this word apologies, a cloud passed over the brow of Athos, a haughty smile curled the lip of Porthos, and a negative sign was the reply of Aramis. "You do not understand me, gentlemen," said D'Artagnan, throwing up his head. the sharp and bold lines of which were at the moment gilded by a bright ray of the sun. I asked to be excused in case I should not be able to discharge my debt to all three, for Monsieur Athos has the right to kill me first, which must much diminish the face value of your bill, Monsieur Porthos, and render yours almost null, Monsieur Aramis. And now, gentlemen, I repeat, excuse me, but on that account only, and on guard!" At these words, with the most gallant air possible, D'Artagnan drew his sword. The blood had mounted to the head of D'Artagnan, and at that moment he would have drawn his sword against all the Musketeers in the kingdom as willingly as he now did against Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. It was 1/4 midday. The sun was in its zenith, and the spot chosen for the scene of the duel was exposed to its full ardor.
"It is very hot," said Athos, drawing his sword in its turn, "and yet I cannot take off my doublet, for I just now felt my wound begin to bleed again, and I should not like to annoy Monsieur with the sight of blood, which he has not drawn from me himself."
"That is true, monsieur," replied D'Artagnan, "and whether drawn by myself or another, I assure you I shall always view with regret the blood of so brave a gentleman. I will therefore fight in my doublet like yourself."
Come, come, enough of such compliments, cried Porthos. "Remember, we are waiting for our turns."
"Speak for yourself when you are inclined to utter such incongruities," interrupted Aramis. "For my part, I think what they say is very well said, and quite worthy of two gentlemen." "When you please, monsieur," said Athos, putting himself on guard.
"I waited your orders," said D'Artagnan, crossing swords. But scarcely had the two rapiers clashed, when a company of the guards of his Eminence, commanded by Monsieur de Jussac, turned the corner of the convent.
"The cardinal's guards!"
cried Aramis and Porthos at the same time.
"Sheath your swords, gentlemen! Sheath your swords!"
But it was too late. The two combatants had been seen in a position which left no doubt of their intentions.
"Hello!"
cried Jussac, advancing toward them and making a sign to his men to do so likewise.
"Hello! Musketeers! Fighting here, are you? And the edicts? What has become of them?" "You are very generous, gentlemen of the guards,"
said Athos, full of rancor, for Jussac was one of the aggressors of the preceding day.
"If we were to see you fighting, I can assure you that we would make no effort to prevent you. Leave us alone, then, and you will enjoy a little amusement without cost to yourselves."
"Gentlemen," said Jussac,
"it is with great regret that I pronounce the thing impossible. Duty before everything. Sheath, then, if you please, and follow us."
"Monsieur," said Aramis, parodying Jussac,
"it would afford us great pleasure to obey your polite invitation if it depended upon ourselves, but unfortunately the thing is impossible. Monsieur de Tréville has forbidden it. Pass on your way, then. It is the best thing to do."
This raillery exasperated Jussac.
"We will charge upon you, then," said he, "if you disobey." "There are 5 of them," said Athos half aloud, "and we are but 3. We shall be beaten again, and must die on the spot. For on my part, I declare I will never appear again before the captain as a conquered man."
Athos, Porthos, and Aramis instantly drew near one another, while Jussac drew up his soldiers. This short interval was sufficient to determine D'Artagnan on the part he was to take. It was one of those events which decide the life of a man. It was a choice between the king and the cardinal. The choice made, it must be persisted in. To fight, that was to disobey the law. That was to risk his head. That was to make at one blow an enemy of a minister more powerful than the king himself. All this the young man perceived, and yet, to his praise we speak it, he did not hesitate a second. Turning toward Athos and his friends, "Gentlemen," said he, "allow me to correct your words, if you please. You said you were but 3, but it appears to me we are 4.
"But you are not one of us,"
said Porthos. "That's true," replied D'Artagnan. "I have not the uniform, but I have the spirit. My heart is that of a Musketeer. I feel it, monsieur,
and that impels me on."
"Withdraw, young man,"
cried Jussac, who doubtless, by his gestures and the expression of his countenance, had guessed D'Artagnan's design.
"You may retire. We consent to that. Save your skin. Be gone quickly."
D'Artagnan did not budge.
"Decidedly, you are a brave fellow,"
said Athos, pressing the young man's hand.
"Come, come, choose your part,"
replied Jussac.
"Well," said Porthos to Aramis, "we must do something."
"Monsieur is full of generosity,"
said Athos, but all three reflected upon the youth of D'Artagnan and dreaded his inexperience.
"We should only be 3, one of whom is wounded, with the addition of a boy," resumed Athos. "And yet it will not be the less said we were 4 men."
"Yes, but to yield,"
said Porthos.
"That is difficult,"
replied Athos. D'Artagnan comprehended their irresolution.
"Try me, gentlemen," said he, "and I swear to you by my honor that I will not go hence if we are conquered." "What is your name, my brave fellow?" said Athos.
"D'Artagnan, monsieur."
"Well, then, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan. Forward!" cried Athos.
"Come, gentlemen, have you decided?"
cried Jussac for the 3rd time.
"It is done, gentlemen," said Athos.
"And what is your choice?"
asked Jussac.
"We are about to have the honor of charging you,"
replied Aramis, lifting his hat with one hand and drawing his sword with the other.
"Ha! You resist, do you? Splud, does that astonish you?"
And the 9 combatants rushed upon each other, with a fury which, however, did not exclude a certain degree of method. Athos fixed upon a certain Cahusac, a favorite of the cardinal's. Porthos had Bicarat, and Aramis found himself opposed to 2 adversaries. As to D'Artagnan, he sprang toward Jussac himself. The heart of the young Gascon beat as if it would burst through his side. Not from fear, God be thanked, he had not the shade of it, but with emulation. He fought like a furious tiger, turning 10 times round his adversary and changing his ground and his guard 20 times. Jussac was, as was then said, a fine blade and had had much practice. Nevertheless, it required all his skill to defend himself against an adversary who, active and energetic, departed every instant from received rules, attacking him on all sides at once, and yet parrying like a man who had the greatest respect for his own epidermis. This contest at length exhausted Jussac's patience. Furious at being held in check by one whom he had considered a boy, he became warm and began to make mistakes. D'Artagnan, who, though wanting in practice, had a sound theory, redoubled his agility. Jussac, anxious to put an end to this, springing forward, aimed a terrible thrust at his adversary, but the latter parried it, and while Jussac was recovering himself, glided like a serpent beneath his blade and passed his sword through his body. Jussac fell like a dead mass. D'Artagnan then cast an anxious and rapid glance over the battlefield. Aramis had killed one of his adversaries, but the other pressed him warmly. Nevertheless, Aramis was in a good situation and able to defend himself. Bicarat and Porthos had just made counter-hits. Porthos had received a thrust through his arm, and Bicarat one through his thigh. But neither of these 2 wounds was serious, and they only fought more earnestly. Athos, wounded anew by a Cahusac, became evidently paler, but did not give way a foot. He only changed his sword hand and fought with his left hand. According to the laws of dueling at the period, D'Artagnan was at liberty to assist whom he pleased. While he was endeavoring to find out which of his companions stood in greatest need, he caught a glance from Athos. The glance was of sublime eloquence. Athos would have died rather than appeal for help, but he could look, and with that look ask assistance. D'Artagnan interpreted it. With a terrible bound he sprang to the side of Cahusac, crying, "To me, Monsieur Guardsman! I will slay you!" Cahusac turned around. It was time for Athos, whose great courage alone supported him, sank upon his knee. "Splud!" cried he to D'Artagnan. "Do not kill him, young man, I beg of you.
I have an old affair to settle with him when I am cured and sound again. Disarm him only. Make sure of his sword. That's it. Very well done."
The exclamation was drawn from Athos by seeing the sword of Cahusac fly 20 paces from him. D'Artagnan and Cahusac sprang forward at the same instant, the one to recover, the other to obtain the sword, but D'Artagnan, being the more active, reached it first and placed his foot upon it. Cahusac immediately ran to the guardsman whom Aramis had killed, seized his rapier, and returned toward D'Artagnan. But on his way he met Athos, who during his relief which D'Artagnan had procured him, had recovered his breath, and who, for fear that D'Artagnan would kill his enemy, wished to resume the fight. D'Artagnan perceived that it would be disobliging Athos not to leave him alone, and in a few minutes Cahusac fell with a sword thrust through his throat. At the same instant, Aramis placed his sword point on the breast of his fallen enemy, and forced him to ask for mercy. There only then remained Porthos and Bicarat. Porthos made 1,000 flourishes, asking Bicarat what o'clock it could be, and offering him his compliments upon his brother's having just obtained a company in the regiment of Navarre. But, just as he might, he gained nothing. Bicarat was one of those iron men who never fell dead. Nevertheless, it was necessary to finish. The watch might come up and take all the combatants, wounded or not, royalists or cardinalists. Athos and Aramis and D'Artagnan surrounded Bicarat and required him to surrender. Though alone against all and with a wound in his thigh, Bicarat wished to hold out. But Jussac, who had risen upon his elbow, cried out to him to yield. Bicarat was a Gascon, and D'Artagnan was. He turned a deaf ear and contented himself with laughing, and between two parries finding time to point to a spot of earth with his sword. "Here," cried he, parodying a verse of the Bible, "here will Bicarat die, for I am only left, and they seek my life." "But there are 4 against you. Leave off, I command you." "Ah, if you command me, that's another thing," said Bicarat. "As you are my commander, it is my duty to obey." And springing backward, he broke his sword across his knee to avoid the necessity of surrendering it, threw the pieces over the convent wall, and crossed him arms, whistling a cardinalist air. Bravery is always respected even in an enemy. The Musketeers saluted Bicarat with their swords and returned them to their sheaths. D'Artagnan did the same. Then, assisted by Bicarat, the only one left standing, they bore Jussac, Cahusac, and one of Aramis's adversaries who was only wounded, under the porch of the convent. The 4th, as we have said, was dead. They then rang the bell, and carrying away 4 swords out of 5, they took their road, intoxicated with joy, toward the hotel of Monsieur de Tréville. They walked arm in arm, occupying the whole width of the street and taking in every Musketeer they met, so that in the end it became a triumphal march. The heart of D'Artagnan swam in delirium. He marched between Athos and Porthos, pressing them tenderly. "If I am not yet a Musketeer," said he to his new friends as he passed through the gateway of Monsieur de Tréville's hotel, "at least I have entered upon my apprenticeship, haven't I?" End of chapter 5.
So I think those 2 chapters are some of the best show don't tell characterization I've ever seen, because you get such a clear picture of Athos, Porthos, and Aramis from the dialogue with D'Artagnan, but you also get a really clear picture of D'Artagnan. I mean, he's impetuous, he's ridiculous, he's a kid, he knows that he's a great fighter. The whole fight thing, the setup to it, reminded me of the fight in The Princess Bride, where it's, you seem like a great fellow, I hate to kill you. You seem like a great fellow, I hate to die. It's that same vibe here, and I love it. I also really loved how confused Athos gets. It's like, wait a minute, you're apologizing because I might not be able to kill you? What? It's just lovely. Porthos's baldric, I told you last week, there was going to be a reason why he kept his cloak very close over his back, and now we know why. So he's the fashionista of the group. I loved the line about D'Artagnan knowing very well how to get into an awkward conversation situation, but not really knowing how to get out of it yet. And I thought, wow, yeah, I feel that completely. And, you would think by now I would have learned, but I love that Aramis says he doesn't take issue with D'Artagnan's words. His words are fine. It's the form, it's the presentation that he has issues with. I love Aramis. I really do. I also love that there's the joke in there about having the greatest respect for your own epidermis. That just kills me. All right. See, it seems very modern. Dumas, man. Excellent writer. Lots of fun. And more hijinks will ensue next week. And speaking of hijinks, you may recall that Thing One, now an adult and also known as Aaron, has been in the process of finishing his senior thesis film at UArts in Philadelphia. And he has done so. And they had the big show, and it got all the laughs, and it was great. And it is now available for you to see. We are trying to work out some kind of an Ask Me Anything online event so that you who have kids who would like to talk to some animators and some voice actors would be able to talk to some animators and some voice actors and ask them questions. And I'll be hosting it, but all the whippersnappers who went into making this film, we try and get as many of them there as possible. It would probably be a Sunday afternoon Eastern time, probably sometime between 3 and 6. But I'm waiting to hear back from all of the kids. So I could not be happier. I could not be more excited. Thing 2, also now an adult known as Aiden, Thing 2 did the music. So when you listen to the score is Aiden. The melodies are largely Aaron, and the writing, design, keyframes is all Aaron. And then he had people volunteer. I don't know if you watched the GoFundMe thing. We'll link out to that too. But he's really trying to pay his animators because he had almost 10 people come to him to offer to help on his senior thesis because he's good. His writing's good. I know I'm a mom. I'm biased. I get it. Oh, and that leads me to the last thing I wanted to share with you. There is an article. I have linked out to it from the show notes. There's an article on bragging. It is the smartest dissection of different kinds of bragging that I have ever seen. So it includes the not really bragging, like, oh, you live on Long Island. Where? If the person happens to be covertly enormously wealthy and they live in the Hamptons, they may say, the Hamptons, and then follow that up with the bad part, which then is a joke and everybody laughs, and that disarms the person who might not be so wealthy and makes them feel more comfortable. That doesn't qualify as a brag. Leading with, I live in the Hamptons, that qualifies as a brag, but there are so many more. There's the humble brag, the excused brag, it just goes on and on. Genius. And especially with Dumas and D'Artagnan. And D'Artagnan just, he's just telling the truth. So is it bragging? Well, you can read about it on this website. And you can also decide what kind of bragging I just did about Aaron. And that'll be good for everybody. I will be emailing or somehow contacting the people on Patreon who are going to be there for the watch party. So you will get information on when and where and how to show up, because we will have the watch party the night before the next episode comes out. She says, and then thinks, ooh, I should check and make sure that that's actually true. Yes, because this comes out on the 19th, And the watch party is on the 25th of May, 2023.